Salim, with the quarantines going on, the self isolation, all of the restrictions on movement for essential people only, I think they're placing their toll on people's patience because both you and I have instances to relate or could relate about people being just a little testier than usual in these troubling times. And I'm wondering whether or not the psychology and the culture of people is changing in such a fashion that we may not get over this with rules restricting people's movement, how far we have to stay away from each other, all the parks closed, elderly people shut in. On the one hand, you've got people standing on their balconies singing songs, like over in Italy. Another case in Britain, of course, you have people going out there almost like in North Korea, applauding the NHS. And here in Canada, I've seen one picture of or video of people outside an apartment complex with a lot of elderly people, and they're doing some dances and asking the people to join in. But on the other hand, people one-on-one in parking lots, in grocery stores, are getting just a little fed up, I think, and we're only into this for a couple of weeks. Some of the authorities are saying we could be into this for a very long time. Frankly, I'm not going to put up with it, but that's what they're saying. And I wonder if our culture is not going to change, not going to get over this. What do you think?
No, I agree with you in the sense that our culture is going to change. In fact, it is rapidly changing, and by the time we come out of it, we'll be entering a much different world than the world in which we went into isolation, self-isolation, quarantine, and lockdowns, and all of that. In some sense, the dropping of the ball on New Year's Eve, as we rang in 2020, will seem, once we enter this world back again, as something of a distant past. I don't know whether we will be able to do that again. I mean, here we are. This is the week. This is the week of Good Friday, Palm Sunday, Good Friday, Passover, and around the world, including Rome, the Vatican, there's been a shutdown. No churches are open, no synagogues are open, no mosques or temples are open where people can go and congregate. And so when we come out, we will be in a completely different world. We will be in a world in which, for lack of a better term, we might call it the full surveillance world. We will be 24/7 under surveillance.
A lot of that started with the attacks by those Saudi nationals on September 11th of 2001, 19 years ago now. And since that time, of course, you've got 20-somethings who don't remember that time before that and have grown up in a surveillance culture. What kind of culture will people who are growing up post-COVID-19, the CCP virus, what kind of culture are they going to be growing up into, and will they get over it?
I mean, it is quite right for you to draw the analogy by going back to 9/11. September 11, 2001 is now almost 20 years. My students in their early 20s have no memory because they were not around. And those who were around, those who were born, were infant in diapers. They have no memory of the world before September 11, 2001. So in a sense, that is before and after. And we entered into a world of surveillance. I mean, it was, as you say, correctly pointed out again, it was on that morning, 4 American planes, wide-body planes, were hijacked by 19 Muslim terrorists, Islamist terrorists, all 19 of them coming from the Middle East. I think of the 19, 14 or 15 were Saudi citizens from Saudi Arabia, and the other 4 were from Lebanon and Egypt. but they were all Islamists. They were all connected with Al Qaeda, and they did what they did. But what happened afterward was that our world changed. We changed ourselves. Our behavior pattern changed. The new normal became that we gladly submitted without any protest to doing what was demanded of us as a people, to subject ourselves to body search, physical search, x-ray search, as we moved along to enter the airport and in places where there international travel, whether it was rail stations, bus stations. It was we who submitted ourselves instead of the world saying, okay, this is where the problem has emanated from, this is where the problem is, and we are going to be much more careful. We will do whatever is needed to protect ourselves from the dangers of the people who have openly declared that they are committed to waging a war against us, that is the Western civilization. But it was we who contorted ourselves. And there is nothing, Robert, that is more, how should I phrase it, more significant than when an individual voluntarily submits to an authority and gives up his freedom or his privacy. So the world we will be entering once the lockdown is over or gradually it is removed, we will enter the world in which the circumference around us of our freedom, of our privacy, of our capacity to make personal decisions and live our life according to the manner in which we want to live, speak, think, read, without surveillance, will have dramatically shrunken.
It's amazing that what you're saying is so true, because if this was like a foreign invasion by some other nation and they were oppressing us, at some point in time we'd throw off the invaders and we'd get back to a normal life. But as you say, when we ourselves impose these obligations onto us, these restrictions, this lack of freedom, then there's no end in sight for it ever to go away. I mean, the 9/11 threat always persists in the background, but there doesn't seem to be any major problem or arising from that happening again, with the measures that we have put in place, with rangers on planes and passengers knowing full well that if somebody hijacks the plane, they're going down. That's not going to happen again. But with this particular virus, as you're saying, made in China, and apparently now the Epoch Times have come out and have some pretty convincing evidence that it was literally made in China by the Communist Chinese Party. But it's in our society, and we're the ones who are changing our life patterns. We're the ones having snitch lines, telling the cops when people are going out jogging more than once over in Britain, or if you're having your store open when it's supposed to be closed. Those snitch lines are reminiscent of East Germany. How are we supposed to get rid of this nonsense when we ourselves are imposing it upon us?
Well, I mean, every authority, including authorities in a free democratic society like ours, want to be able to control the actions of people that they are ruling over. Remember the famous lines of Benjamin Franklin when he was asked, after he came out of the constitutional conference in Philadelphia, they had established, or they had voted on the Constitution, and the woman, according to the story, asked, Mr. Franklin, what have you done? And he famously replied, or his reply has become famous, we have just now established a republic, and it is up to the people whether they will keep it, So freedom is we are born. It is our inalienable right. A child is born as a free individual into the world. And then as he grows up, that freedom, through various reasons and mechanisms, shrinks. But in a culture of freedom, such as ours, at least until now, we could at least distinguish between what we do for ourselves and with others, and what others coerce us to do or force us to do. So to imagine the world that we are going to be entering, reading the writings of people who have lived in a totalitarian society, who have grown up in totalitarian societies, and have either escaped, come out of those totalitarian societies, or the totalitarian societies have crumbled. I have in mind the Soviet Union as, countries that were under the Soviet control, the East European countries. It is fascinating to read about the culture, which you might call is a fear culture. That is what Nathan Sharansky called it, or Czesław Miłosz, the great Polish writer, who was given the Nobel Prize, talked about in his book called it the captive mind. The captive mind, you control the mind, and you educate people right from kindergarten, from grade 1, from within the family structure. The education is about what is right, what is wrong, as decided by those in authority. And then, as you're talking about snitching, you report when somebody, according to the standards and the requirements that the authority has put in place, they break those standards or seem to be breaking those standards, then you report them. But now you don't have to report them. The captive mind is now 24/7, 365 days a year in a situation of total surveillance. We will have drones. It's not a question of we will have it. We have it already. In stories out of New York, drones have been flying around Central Park, and a voice comes out that you're not keeping the proper social distance. So it'll be a voice saying you that you're not keeping a proper social distance, and we are observing you. And the next step will be that immediately the drone will snap you, and there will be a police officer, an officer just there to check on social distancing, will be there to give you a ticket,
Sorry to interrupt you, Salim, there, but it's amazing how easily we accept this without any protest. I think you gave me a scenario before. It was One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Remember that play, that movie? And we're living in a cuckoo's nest, and it's you and me who are that guy who came in from prison, who's the sane one, and people want to lobotomize us for daring to tell them that there's a better way.
Yeah. Nice of you to remind me. Ken Kesey's book, which became such a hot-selling movie, The One Who Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, captures idiomatically the situation where, in that scenario, the sane person, the person who has his mind, who is not a bunker, goes into the cuckoo's nest, which is the psychiatric hospital where all the people suspected of having, in some ways, lost their sanity are being kept and being treated. And the people in the cuckoo's nest, they have created a culture of their own, which is they believe that they are sane, and the sane person comes in, and in a very short time, the sane person starts questioning his own sanity. whether he is any more sane, because in the perspective of the residents of the cuckoo nest, his sane behavior is now insane. Well, this was again, they're writing the book, the famous book by Heller, Cat 22. That's what I'm talking about. Czesław Miłos's The Captive Mind. Yes, the capacity to maintain one's freedom is not only a demand upon the individual of a degree of vigilance and understanding and self-awareness, and therefore also the requisite courage to say, this is how I think, this is how I will speak, this is my behavior, this is my way of conducting according to the values that I treasure. But it can snap very easily. It is very fragile, especially if the people around that individual are speaking a different language in terms of culture, And so it is the culture that changes, The language might still be the same language, but the meaning of the language, that is, the subtext of the language, changes. I mean, for instance, you and I can pick up the book by Chaucer, the Canterbury Tale, but we have to be familiar with the meaning of the language that Chaucer presumably was writing in early English, that we can understand now, several centuries later, and possibly we won't. It would need an expert in that particular Old English language, Celtic language, to be able to decipher the meaning. So cultures change, and what I am concerned about, in the sense of that what we are discussing, is that when we come out of this situation that we are in, into which we very readily moved in, by the way, Robert, we moved in without any coercion and resistance, because of the fear, the genuine fear, the larger society. I mean, we can individually debate about how toxic, how deadly this Wuhan virus or COVID-19 is, and to what extent the pandemic of Wuhan virus is actually more or less than the normal situation in the casualties of a flu season annually that happens, So those can be debated, but the fear that was either orchestrated or we felt it, as the medium turned upon it, this fear drove us in a certain direction. I'm talking about the general people, and here we are, and this culture will change. The culture will change in the way that, when boarding the plane after 9/11, walking into the airport after 9/11, it didn't matter whether you were a poet, a writer, a doctor, an ambassador, or whoever. The culture, we all accepted that each of us are in some way, a threat to the people who will be boarding the plane unless we, go through the body search and the luggage check and all of the protocol that was devised after 9/11, so that we are not going to be the individual who will hijack the plane and fly the plane into some building. Well, now the issue is, simply the suspicion through a cough, through a sneeze, through a seasonal allergy that many of us are vulnerable to, the pollen in the air, can immediately be read as the preliminary sign of being an individual who is a bioweapon and therefore needs to be moved out and put away in self-isolation until the authorities decide that you are clean and you can go out and you can engage with the other.
That's
the
what's got me
world
concerned.
we are entering into.
That's got me concerned as well, because I could agree with quarantining people who are ill, who are contagious. That's reasonable, that makes sense. Or even people who are coming from areas of contagion, makes sense. But quarantining, self-quarantining, healthy individuals for their own good, or for the potential of them perhaps, maybe, with very small statistics, infecting somebody else, that's totally unacceptable. There's such a thing called inalienable rights. It means they can't be taken away on a whim or a hope, on a statistic. And closing businesses, 6.6 million people now unemployed in the States who weren't before this. Over 1 million in Canada, about 1.5 million in Canada, unemployed because of these measures. Totally unnecessary. Sweden hasn't done it, and they're doing fine, by the way. Their numbers of deaths or incidences of contagion are not drastically higher than any other nation who is doing what we're doing. Same with Japan. Didn't close their society. They took reasonable measures, but they didn't have to destroy their economy to do it. What is it about the Canadian people, the Canadian government, that we have reached such a critical mass of belief in Big Brother that we're willing to do it, first of all, and we're willing to accept it, second of all?
Well, Robert, I mean, since both of us are Canadians, so we want to talk about Canada, but I don't see this as Canada as an exception. I'm talking about the culture of the West, the culture of freedom. You know, by the way, 9/11 and the protocols that were set up after 9/11 for us to travel by air, board airplane and so on and so forth. These protocols did not emerge out of some poor African country or some third world country. It didn't come from India or Southeast Asia or Thailand, you know. These protocols were developed and put into place in a culture that until now, until this moment that you and I are speaking about it, and when we go back and look at our history and how it evolved, that this culture was based upon the culture of individual freedom. I mean, our charter talks about rights and freedom. Rights and freedom means nothing if it is not individual rights and individual freedom, you know. It is in the American Declaration of Independence, which is part of the constitutional arrangement of America and has gone into the Constitution, the inalienable right, the freedom of speech, the freedom to bear arms. These are, you know, in the American Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the first of the 10 amendments, the first 10 amendments. It is the shredding of this culture of freedom, incrementally, gradually, that a point then arrives that it is no longer a culture of freedom. It is a culture of surveillance. And it is the people who have embraced that. You know, I mean, there's a struggle going on in America right now as we speak, because the word unalienable comes out of the American constitutional documents, you know. And so there is still within the American society, politics, population, the antibody to the culture of surveillance that the people are willing, at this moment in time, willing to really fight and resist any further abridgment of, say, the First Amendment right, or say the Second Amendment right, you know. So we are seeing that struggle going on. But the more relevant question, Bob, is why the struggle? A struggle happens when there is, you know, an X and Y situation in which one part of the system, the Y, doesn't accept the other part of the system X value. Because if X and Y all agreed upon the values upon which the society has been built upon, there wouldn't be any struggle. The fact that the struggle has become more and more acute, We talk about now, in the case of America, blue state and red state, that the people in the red state are strangers to the people in the blue states in terms of values. In Canada, it is, I suppose, similar. You know, we have Western Canada, the more rugged, pioneer culture of still there, of the settlers, of the people who built Canada. And then we have in central Canada, a culture that is now emergent as a result of migration and immigration, in which that culture is found to be offensive to the growing majority in central Canada, you know, a culture that they're willing to embrace and jettison the other culture. This is the dynamics that is going on. But the situation that now has come about as a result of this Wuhan virus pandemic, it provides the people in authority who are already have that impulse. People in authority, whether you're a school teacher, whether you're a police officer on the beat, whether you are, you know, a security guard in a railway station or a bus station, or now in our airports, all the way to, you know, being the premier or prime minister, there is that impulse to control the other. It takes a very extraordinary human being in that position to say that no, the culture of freedom is more important, the respect for the individual right is more important, even though I might have the authority to abridge that right of the other person, it won't happen. And you can see this if you observe around you what is happening. And I'll give you an anecdote from I mean, you know, the other day I was just coming out of Costco, where I had gone to pick up a few items. I parked my car in the proper parking place, and we had done the social distancing. I had waited for about 25 to 30 minutes in the line in a pretty cold weather because the winds were blowing. We were outside to maintain the social distance or the political or the physical distance and be ushered into the Costco. And then I come out and I'm in my car, and I'm very, very carefully and gently at a snail's pace pulling back and got myself into proper direction and slowly advancing. And this man pushing a push cart, a middle-aged man pushing a push cart loaded, instead of walking past me, in front of me, I mean, he's walking towards his car, I suppose, walking past me, stops, glowers at me, raises his hand up, points his finger and says, I better stop, as if I was going to overrun him, you know? And here it is. I don't think in normal times this would have happened, unless the person himself was in some way, you know, that is his character. But here it is. This behavior, this conduct is indicative of the coarsening of our culture, the culture that we are entering into, a 24/7 surveillance. The technology is now available, and the technology will become even more sophisticated as we go on. But the people themselves are readily willing to become part of the culture of surveillance and not remain protective and defending the culture of freedom, you know.
Yeah.
In terms of their calculation, and the calculation will grow. I'll give you another example. It was 30 years ago or more that we began talking about recycling our waste, and we started putting a blue box out, and it would be recycled, and we separate the bottles, and we separate the paper item from other garbage item, and then recycle them. And it all began, you know, more than 30 years ago. But in this period, a whole generation was born, a whole generation was educated. And what was a matter of being concerned about our environment in terms of waste and keeping it clean and so on and so forth. You know, I had been a Boy Scout, you know, I grew up learning that, practicing that. But what happened, that culture of maintaining environment awareness morphed into the politics of man-made global warming. And here we are, this whole exercise of the argument that carbon dioxide, which is the stuff of life, is a poison. We have to get rid of the greenhouse gas emission, and there are going to be penalties. And here we are, our prime minister, during this pandemic, where all of us are locked down and shut down, and people are losing their job. They don't know, what will happen to the saving, what sort of inflation will come and make their money absolutely useless. He is bringing down more carbon tax, and people are ready to accept it.
Salim, a lot of young people are calling this virus the boomer remover, and quite gleefully too. It's quite disgusting because they see people like you and me of the boomer generation. I was born in 61, so that's just at the very tail end of it. They see us as having ideas antithetical to their very ultra-left-wing views of the world, their PC views of the world. And I think that the picture that you're painting right now, going into the future, from a surveillance culture to a culture of snitches, is a very bleak picture indeed. And I think that once the boomer generation is gone, all that's left for these people to do would be to burn our books. And then they'd have no idea what freedom is at all. I think we'll leave it there, Salim, because it's getting really depressing. But thank you very much once again.
Thank you.